experts share tips on how people can manage stress in the final days leading up to elections. According to one UW Health psychologist, the closeness of the race can cause people to panic and worry about the possible outcome. To manage that stress, doctors recommend taking a time out from election coverage and setting boundaries with those who have different opinions.
In the United States, we are a melting pot of so many different viewpoints, and I think that's part of our strength. And there can be some benefit to having people in our lives that think differently, vote differently. And so if you find yourself feeling some tension of thinking about seeing that relative or family member coming up, you might think about what kind of boundary you could set